Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to another of the lectures in the Blue and Gray Education Society's 1995 series on the Vicksburg Campaign, conducted in Jackson, Mississippi, with the lectures taking place in the Edison Walthall Hotel in Jackson, Mississippi, and in the old Capitol Museum, which was the Civil War era Capitol of Jackson, Mississippi during the Civil War, which survived the war. This lecture that I want to speak to you about today says something of the breadth of the BGES's interest and its attempts to present an even and balanced picture. African Americans made a huge difference in this Civil War. About 180,000 of them served in the Union Army, and in the South, Black slaves were impressed in numbers that proved to be force multipliers for Southern soldiers who didn't have to do the same sorts of fatigue tasks that they farmed off on the blacks, which allowed them to focus on soldierly types of actions and so forth. So the role of blacks has always been a very important element of our studies over the past 26 years or so. And early on, we recognized this by incorporating a study and a lecture of a battlefield that disappeared, not because of neglect, but because it was so close to the Mississippi River and the river changed course that it basically washed out the battlefield at Miliken's Bend. What's important about Miliken's Bend is that this is one of the very first instances of Black soldiers in combat. The very first took place in Missouri at a place called Island Mound, involving the 1st Kansas Infantry, which was an unofficial and unaccepted infantry regiment recruited by Colonel Jim Lane, Senator Jim Lane in Kansas, that Lincoln was unwilling to muster into the Army. However, they were organized, and they did end up fighting a brief action at Fort Africa in western Missouri during the Civil War in 1862. Other actions that took place involving Black soldiers preceded the more famous engagement represented by the movie Glory, which I'm sure most everybody has seen. There were several engagements in the Vicksburg Campaign, one in the assault at Port Hudson, and another on the Union supply base by Confederates, defended by African American soldiers on the Louisiana side of the Mississippi River in June of 1863. So I didn't want to overlook that in terms, because we were not going to visit that battlefield. There was nothing to see at that time. So I wanted to deal with this backwater event. And I asked Terry Jones how much he knew of that, and he knew a fair amount about it. He said that he would be comfortable speaking in a little bit better than general terms about it. And so at the tail end of the program, I asked Terry, and he agreed and presented, with questions and answers, a talk of about 35 to 40 minutes on the Battle of Miliken's Bend. It's a fight marked by the heroism of soldiers. You know, I'm a retired military officer, and I have a lot of friends. I spend a lot of time in Blue and Gray, spends a lot of time with veterans who are war casualties, who have had arms and legs blown off by IEDs and have been wounded and otherwise suffered the wounds of war. And you know, I've found in every single one of them, as the Union soldiers found, and the Confederates as well, found in the Civil War, that, you know, once you were shot, you bled the same color, you bled red. And so to understand the path of the Black soldier and their role in the Civil War, and ultimately that performance and how it led to the 13th and 14th Amendments and the budding civil rights movement, is to appreciate that Blacks fought for their freedom in the American Civil War. And this is one of the first events in which it happened. please join me in welcoming Terry Jones to talk about the Battle of Milliken's Bend, Louisiana.
Thank you all for inviting me to come back and participate in the program again. As Lynn said, I was going to talk about really one of the little lesser-known aspects of the Vicksburg Campaign, the Battle of Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, which took place on June the 7th, 1863. When Grant was besieging Vicksburg during the spring and early summer of 1863, he had a rather long, precarious supply line that stretched from Vicksburg up through Milliken's Bend to Lake Providence, Louisiana. Milliken's Bend was one of several supply depots that provided food, ammunition, medicine to Grant's army. The town itself of Milliken's Bend has since washed away into the river. There never was a whole lot to the place. It was just a small port about 20 miles upriver from Vicksburg. It's set, or the Union camp set between two levees, which kind of become important during the coming battle. There was one levee that ran more or less right along the riverbank, and then there was about 150 yards space inland, and then there was a second levee further to the inland. And in between these two levees, this open space was where the Union encampment was and the supply depot. Guarding Milliken's Bend were about 900 black soldiers. You have to remember that at this time, early June 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was less than 6 months old, and it was still very controversial to use black soldiers in the Union Army. In fact, Grant, Sherman, probably most Midwestern soldiers did not approve of using blacks. It was generally considered that they would not make good soldiers, that years of slavery had made them too docile, that they were too afraid of their masters, that they were lazy, they did not adhere to military discipline. So there was a great deal of opposition to even enlisting black soldiers, and the idea of using them in combat was almost totally foreign to most white northern troops. But at Milliken's Bend, a so-called African brigade had been this comprised about 900 men. They were all from the local parishes and from a few of the counties across the river Mississippi. There were 3 regiments. One was the 9th Louisiana Colored Infantry, the 11th Louisiana Colored Infantry, and the 1st Mississippi Colored Infantry. These 3 black units had all white officers, and that was one of the sort of compromise made when Lincoln did begin to enlist black soldiers. It was decided they would have to have white officers to train them and to command them. These black soldiers were very poorly trained. They, in fact, one regiment had not even received their muskets. In fact, they received them the day before the battle actually began. But they were enthusiastic and they were looking forward to service. Now, during the campaign for Vicksburg, the Confederate authorities were desperate to find some way to relieve Vicksburg. And General John C. Pemberton, the commander inside the city, sent a rather desperate message to General Edmund Kirby Smith, who commanded the Trans-Mississippi Department, more or less begging him to do something on the western side of the river to relieve the siege. The only force that Kirby Smith had to do anything with was a Texas division under General John Walker, which was in Arkansas at the time. His main commander was General Richard Taylor, who was in the Alexandria area. So Kirby Smith complied with Pemberton's request and sent a message to General Taylor in the Alexandria area, ordering Taylor to proceed to the Vicksburg region, to the little town of Richmond, which today no longer really exists. It's near the modern-day town of Tallulah, Louisiana, about 20 miles on the other side of the river. And Taylor was ordered to take Walker's division and attack Grant's supply line and try to relieve the siege, to disrupt the siege. And rather bizarrely, Taylor was ordered that if the opportunity arose, he was actually to enter the city and reinforce the garrison. Taylor, to say the least, was very reluctant of this plan. He was an extremely intelligent general. And as he later said, he said the problem was to try to get the garrison out of Vicksburg, not to put more men into it. But the good soldier he was, he obeyed. So Taylor headed for Richmond, and there on June 6th, he was met by Walker's division. Walker had about 4,000 Texans, and Taylor believed that the only possibility of success was to surprise the Union garrisons along the river. So speed was of the essence. He made a night march out of Richmond down a small country road to a crossroads. It was in the dead of night on the night of June 6th. And there at the crossroads, his plan developed. It was a rather simple plan. What Taylor had in mind to do was, at the crossroad, one of Walker's brigades, the brigade of Brigadier General Henry McCullough, which had about 1,500 men, they would take a road leading to the left from Miliken and attack it. Then a second brigade under J.M. Halls would take a right fork and would head to another Union outpost at Young's Point, closer to Vicksburg itself. The 3rd Texas Brigade under Horace Randall would stay at the crossroad itself and act as reserve of these other 2 attacking units. Then, rather strange decision, both General Walker and Taylor decided to neither would accompany the attacking brigades, but both of them stayed at the crossroad with Randall's reserve brigade. And if you've ever studied General Taylor, Richard Taylor, this is very uncharacteristic of him. Taylor was an extremely aggressive general and very much a hands-on general. And for him to stay behind, several miles behind where the action is going to take place, seems very odd. And to me, at least, it seems to indicate that Taylor had no faith at all in this campaign, and that he had kind of resigned himself to the fact that it's not going to accomplish too much, and he just sort of turns it over to the Texans and let them handle it. Well, the surprise that Taylor had hoped on and was really counting on simply wasn't that. As it turned out, during June 6th and during the night of June 6th and early morning of June 7th, as they marched to their points of attack, Louisiana cavalrymen under Isaac Harrison had already made contact with the Union pickets and patrols, alerting Colonel Henry Lee, who commanded the black troops there at Miliken's Bend, that something was afoot in the area. So Colonel Lee sent word back down towards Vicksburg that he needed reinforcements. And the 23rd Iowa, which comprised about 300 men, they were sent to Miliken's Bend, plus 2 gunboats. The USS Choctaw and the USS Lexington were sent up, and they anchored in the river just off Miliken's Bend. The Union soldiers prepared a rather sturdy defense. They took up a position on the inland levee, the second levee from the river. They also piled up cotton bales on top of the levee to reinforce their position, and they were well prepared by daylight of June 7th. So at the crack of dawn, when the Texans came storming out of the woods across the cotton fields, screaming the rebel yell, many of the black soldiers later claimed, probably correctly so, that the Texans also raised the cry of no quarter, along with various racial slurs. Unfortunately for the Texans, the terrain quickly broke up their attack. This area had apparently not been farmed for a number of years. And the whole region fronting the levee, the Union position, was badly cut up with very thick Osage orange hedgerows, briar patches, and thickets. In many places, there were only narrow little outlets where troops could funnel through. So when the Texans approached the levee, they were funneled into these small killing zones, and they were badly shot up by the Union soldiers. But they raised the rebel yell, they attacked, and they fought their way up to the levee, and almost immediately the 23rd Iowa, the black troops, turned and ran. They bugged out and headed back to the river and the first levee along the edge of the bank, leaving the black soldiers there to hold the line. There was a rather brief but vicious fight on this first levee. The Texans won, and the black soldiers also began to retreat across that 150-yard open space towards the other levee. Apparently, there was quite a bit of slaughter in that area. One of the Texas soldiers later said that as the blacks turned and retreated, Probably an exaggeration, but this one Texan said that we bayoneted them by the hundreds in that area. They fought their way up to the first levee along the river, and it was there that the most vicious part of the fight took place. A really bloody, nasty hand-to-hand battle erupted along this levee. The Texans mostly using clubbed muskets and musket butts, the blacks using bayonets and musket butts. A lot of pent-up racial hatred obviously was involved, and everyone who was there said it was one of the worst fights, intense fights they've been in the war. And eventually, though, the blacks won. They beat off the Texans, plus the fact that the two gunboats were lobbing shells into the area. So after this hand-to-hand fight, the Texans broke off the engagement, fled back across the gap, and took up a position on the other side of the first levee. And from there, the battle broke into a stalemate. The Texans couldn't charge again across the open space. The Union soldiers were content to hold their position along the levee with the gunboat support. McCulloch, realizing that things had stalemated, sent word back to the crossroads 4 or 5 miles in the rear, asking for Randall's brigade to come up as reinforcement. But in the time it took Randall's brigade to come up, McCulloch realized it was hopeless, that they could not take the position. And by the time Taylor and Randall and Walker arrived in the battlefield, McCulloch was already withdrawing. They collected their dead, the Confederates collected their dead, wrapped them up in blankets, buried them in a mass grave right there on the battlefield. During the battle, there had been some flanking maneuvers in which the Texans had managed to capture. The exact number is not clear, but I think probably close to 70 Union soldiers, all but about 2 of them were black. So probably around 68 black soldiers were captured and 2 of their white officers were captured. So when Taylor arrived, the rebels withdrew along with their captives and pulled back into the dense woods. The battle, the Confederates, for their part, they had failed. Hall's brigade, just briefly, never even made their attack. Hall's did a rather poor job in approaching Young's Point. He was stymied by trying to cross some bayous where the bridge had been destroyed. He spent the whole morning trying to find fords, and finally he just more or less called off the attack. So no attack was ever made at Young's Point. Casualties were pretty high. The battle itself did not last more than a couple of hours. On the Union side, the initial report said that there were 101 dead, 285 wounded, and my estimate, they give a larger figure, but my estimate about 70 were taken prisoner. I think they listed about 100 or 200 missing, but most of those straggled back into camp later. These casualties are ignored historians, because if you look at it more closely, one of the black regiments, the 9th Louisiana Colored Infantry, went into the fight with 285 men. They later reported that 128 were killed or mortally wounded. So obviously a lot of those 285 died after. That makes about a 45% fatality rate in one regiment, in one battle. And as far as I can tell, that's the highest death rate suffered by any regiment on either side in one engagement in the entire war, but yet you never read anything about it, because these are former slaves with inconspicuous battle in the Trans-Mississippi. Walker's losses were not as severe. He reported 44 dead, 131 wounded, and 10 missing. Now, one of the things that's important about Miliken's Bend is what happened after the battle. Almost immediately there was a intense controversy raised over what happened to those 70 prisoners that were taken by the Confederates. And it's known they were taken prisoner. The Confederates mentioned it. Particularly these couple of white officers were seen being led back in the woods by their captors. The controversy kind of centered around a Confederate law that had been passed. In response to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Confederate Congress, outraged by the raising of black troops by the North, passed a law saying that any white officer of a black unit that was captured in battle would be executed. The technical reason was that they were inciting servile insurrection, slave insurrection. And any blacks captured in uniform would be turned over to the states that they were captured in for disposal. And I think generally that meant they would probably be just re-enslaved. So you have that law, then you have these captives. Well, immediately, rumors spread back to Grant at Vicksburg that immediately after the battle, the white officers and a number of the black captives had been summarily executed. And there are any numbers of stories of saying what happened. Some are simple, said that they were just taken in the woods and shot. One story came out that a white officer and some of the black soldiers were hanging near Richmond with General Taylor personally observing him. The worst case that I read was a newspaper correspondent reported that a Union cavalry patrol came across a burned house somewhere in the bayous just back behind Miliken's Bend, and said that white officers and black soldiers had been nailed to boards, crucified, and leaned against trees and burned alive, and others had been nailed to boards and leaned against houses, and the houses set fire, and they were burned alive. So when these stories got back to Grant, Grant sent a message by a flag of truce to Taylor demanding an accounting. And the two corresponded through couriers for some while. Taylor vehemently denied anything happened. Taylor said the white captives were being treated as prisoners of war, that the black soldiers were being turned over to the state of Louisiana in accordance with the congressional law. After some investigating, Grant accepted Taylor's explanation, and Grant himself wrote that he never really believed them. It was just so outrageous he couldn't believe that it had happened. So the whole matter was dropped. But there's been some recent research done on this case, and we'll never know exactly what happened, but I think there's some pretty safe assumptions. It's fairly clear the Texans did not go out of their way to take prisoners. They probably did cry no quarter. And in a battle that included an awful lot of hand-to-hand combat and flanking maneuvers and units being cut off, to have only 60 or 70 men captured is rather outrageous. So probably both sides committed atrocities on the battlefield. It's also becoming more and more obvious that the Confederates probably did execute those two white officers. They were seen being led away from the battlefield. They were never seen again. They never arrived at a Confederate prisoner of war camp. They never came home after the war. These white officers just vanished. And in fact, on their muster, they are listed as murdered by the Confederates at Miliken's Bend. The odd thing is that it does not appear that any of the black captives were killed. It seems like all 65 or 68 or so of them were taken to Tyler, Texas, to the Confederate prison camp there, and it appears that all of them survived. They all came home after the war, so they were not turned over to the Confederate, to the state of Louisiana as they were supposed to. They were sent off to a prison camp just like any other white prisoner of war. Now, what is the significance of Miliken's Bend? Militarily, not much. It did not affect the campaign. It did not disrupt the supplies. That's probably why the battle's not studied.